Good afternoon and welcome to the Investor Responsibility Research Institute and Sustainable Investments Institute webinar today on a new report, Board Oversight of Sustainability Issues. Our agenda today is quick introductions, an in-depth review of the research. We'll provide IRRC Institute's perspective on the research and then take your questions. Just a couple points on webinar logistics. Everyone on the call today is in listen-only mode, but your questions are encouraged. At the end of the session, we'll ask you to type question into the question function dialog box over on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, if you are interested, you can listen to a replay of this webinar by tomorrow. We'll send a link with that information. This report and all our other research is available on irrcinstitute.org. We'll also post the PowerPoint that you will see today on the website as well. We encourage you to share this PowerPoint with others. It's available. You can tweet at IRC Research and use the hashtag IRC Research. If you have any problems with the audio or any other technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. Our speakers today are Peter DeSimone. He's the report author and co-founder and deputy director of SI Institute. Peter's bio is on their website, and you can read that in more depth. But just so you know, he's been working in the field of sustainable investing for almost 2 decades. He was a deputy director. He was a director for programs at USSIF, and he's authored other reports for the Institute as well. Our other speaker today is John Lekumnick. He's the executive director of the Investor Responsibility Research Institute. He's widely recognized as one of the top and most influential people in corporate governance issues. And he also was the investment advisor for the New York City Pension Fund. So he has quite a bit of experience working on investment issues. Just quick couple words about the Investor Responsibility Research Institute. It was established in 2005. Essentially what we do is fund and disseminate research on a range of issues that examines a capital market context that impacts how investors and companies make decisions. We also sponsor an annual research award. You can take a look at our 5-year impact report that's available on our website. And all the research is available at no charge. You can see on this next slide that here that all of the research touches on a wide range of issues. Our two most recent reports are listed at the top here. Defining Engagement was released about a week or so ago. And we've done research on topics from sustainability issues to executive compensation to voting decisions at U.S. mutual funds, and also on hydraulic fracturing, shale gas, and metrics that matter. So full range of research available to you. And with that, I will hand it over to Peter, and he will tell you a little bit about SI2, and he will cover the research in detail. Peter?
Good day, everyone. I know everybody's eager to get to the research results, but if you just give me a moment, I'd like to tell you, some of you who might not be familiar with the Sustainable Investments Institute, a little bit about us. We take a different approach to proxy research that centers on empowering investors to make their own informed decisions on key votes on environmental and social policy resolutions instead of offering recommendations. And we provide in-depth research and support services to assist our clients. And this unique tact on proxy voting is evident throughout our offerings. For example, we provide in-depth briefing papers on the foremost issues confronting companies and their investors at annual meetings, for example, on sustainability reporting and political spending and human rights. And during proxy season, we also offer comprehensive company reports outlining both sides of the debate on any given proposal coming to a vote, as well as supplemental research on any reports or articles, other collateral referenced by the proponents or the company. We offer comparisons of how the company in question stacks up to its competitors, and we offer a cost-benefit analysis of implementing any given resolution. We also help our clients in developing guidelines for voting. We offer some benchmarking data, and our analysts average more than 20 years of experience in the field of sustainable and responsible investing. So we're really proud of that. And, those are the types of analysts that are writing reports for you. Our clients include the country's largest public pension funds, college and university endowments, foundations and SRI funds, and we also do grant research to explore emerging issues of investor and corporate responsibility, as is the case with this report. And I'd like to just briefly give a few thank yous first to the Investor Responsibility Research Center Institute for funding the research and helping us get to the end of it and to publication. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues Heidi Welsh and Robin Young for assisting in some of the research, for acting as sounding boards, and for helping me complete the report. So thank you, Kelly, for advancing for me there. So I'd like to start off with a little bit of a review of our method for collecting and parsing the data to help you better understand the results. It's important to place them into context. We studied the S&P 500 as our previous research consistently has indicated that larger companies are more inclined to have sustainability policies, programs, and reporting. Also, the S&P 500 covered almost all of the companies targeted by proponents with shareholder proposals requesting board oversight of various environmental and social issues. So we thought this would be a good place to start. It is only a beginning. We reviewed all the committee charters for each company, along with their sustainability reporting. We looked at the latter for cases where companies describe board oversight responsibilities, perhaps as part of a global reporting initiative disclosure, but did not have these responsibilities enumerated in a committee charter. And this was, sorry, let me check it. This was the case for 29 of the companies. So that was an interesting result, and we're so glad we took that extra step in the research. This most often happened when companies, again, claimed that the board at large had responsibility for oversight, and therefore there was no evidence of this oversight in the committee charters we reviewed. We used the, I wasn't quite ready to advance there, Kelly, but you know what, that's fine, you can leave that up there. We use the Global Industrial Classification System, or GICS, to classify companies in industry sectors based on the revenue they derive from various products and activities. And I know some companies disagree with this method as they feel they are more diversified than a single industry labeling parts. But I found it's largely representative of the company's activities, and it enabled us to post some interesting industry trends in the report. And we collected, revenue and earnings data from Form 10Ks of companies, which is pretty straightforward. For each company, if applicable, we identified the committee charged with oversight of sustainability issues and recorded its name. We did later classify those names and tried to group them a little bit to make some sense of it. If more than one committee had oversight responsibilities, we noted both and picked a primary committee for the remainder of our data collection. And some of that collection revolves around the setting of independence standards and the desire to have some sort of expertise on that committee. The multiple committee scenario, I should point out, only played out at 6 companies, so it wasn't a large percentage of them. For each with the board committee charged with oversight of one or more sustainability issues, we also recorded the issues covered. Again, we looked at the independence standards for the committee. We reviewed expertise requirements if there were any, and noted the capacity to hire advisors. On issues, we decided to focus only on environmental and social topics. As the report notes, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 requires the audit committee to oversee allegations of fraud and other ethical lapses related to financial statements. And at the beginning of our research, when we did a quick review during the study period, we did reveal some differentiation in approaches and nuance of language. in this area, but there wasn't a clear way for us to parse the information. Um, we thought about perhaps doing a basic ethics and an ethics plus checkbox, or giving credit for going beyond just looking at accounting and financial fraud. But in the end, we decided to leave it for another day. Just very quickly, to get credit for covering an issue, it had to be mentioned by name or explicitly in context. So, for example, for climate change, a company could have spelled out oversight of climate change, global warming, greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon footprint, renewable energy strategies, or some other closely related topic. But simply giving board oversight and responsibilities for environmental issues did automatically click off oversight of climate change. So reviewing the results, you should keep this in mind, and I'll raise this point again when we review the issues covered. Since in many cases, I think companies would argue that oversight of environmental issues, for example, includes climate change. I think that's the point that most of us could agree with. However, for us, it was another way of differentiating companies and looking a little bit deeper to their approaches. I'm happy to answer other questions on our methods, but I don't want to get too heavily steeped in this. But feel free to ask questions at the end if you feel there's something you don't quite understand on our approach or our findings. The slide you see in front of you right now is a review of the shareholder proposal activity over the last several decades. And we view shareholder activism as a driver of corporations adopting various sustainability policies and practices, and a reflection of the larger engagement activity between companies and investors. Recent shareholder data on board oversight sustainability issues, in fact, prompted us to do this study. Now, I know the chart depicts an explosion in shareholder activism on board oversight sustainability issues, but I want to replace these results in a little bit of context. First, the shareholder activism on sustainability issues has grown tremendously over the time period, especially in the past 2 decades. And this year alone set another record for filings of environmental and social resolutions. So we're seeing a lot of activity in all areas. So that's important in looking at this chart. Second, a significant proportion of the filings were on political spending, as you can see in that sort of lighter blue block that grew tremendously in the last decade and in the 5 years that we studied in this decade. And the resolutions were largely coordinated by the Center for Political Accountability, and they call on companies to have board oversight of political spending, although this request is not the main thrust of the resolution, so that's important to factor in here. Many of the other resolutions, for example, in this area do focus exclusively on the board oversight issue, and many times ask for board oversight of a particular issue. Nonetheless, and definitely by no coincidence, political spending also was the most popular subtopic for board oversight among the issues we studied. So the campaign is certainly transforming boards. However, at the same time, the chart depicts growth across other issues too, including requests for board oversight of sustainability more broadly, in addition to a handful of environmental issues as well as human rights. And you can see that sustainability at the bottom in the darkest blue, and human rights is in gray at the top of those last 2 bars there. So, there's sort of an expanding movement of requests in this area. Next slide, Kelly. Thank you. We've also seen support for these resolutions grow from the single digits in the 1990s to more than 26% during this decade. Support in general for these types of resolutions is higher than the average for all other social and environmental policy resolutions. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Higher support levels tend to generate greater attention for corporate boards and management. And they also tend to lead to eventually larger percentages of withdrawal agreements, including some, if not all, of the changes that proponents seek. So it's, the issue itself is garnering greater support among investors. I think it's important to note here. and that this in turn could lead to additional changes of corporate boards going forward. Next slide, please, Kelly. Thank you. As mentioned earlier, we tracked the type of sustainability reporting each company committed to, whether it was a report using a type of GRI guidelines at a particular reporting level, or a claim of having an integrated financial sustainability report of some type, or another type of sustainability reporting practice. And we track this information as a test of the effectiveness and part of board oversight in promoting transparency and reporting on sustainability issues. And it looks like there at least is a bit of a correlation or two there. But first I should note that there were only 8 integrated reporters in the study, although there were 214 GRI reporters. So there was a much broader adoption of GRI reporting standards out there. Nonetheless, both types had higher rates of boards with oversight of sustainability issues than the average, although by a much smaller margin for the GRI reporters. But I think it's an interesting finding that we're seeing, of course, in addition to greater board oversight among this group of companies, a little bit more in the way of transparency reporting as well. Next slide, please, Kelly. Nominating and governance committees were the most likely to be charged with oversight of environmental and social issues, followed closely by public affairs and sustainability committees, and then boards at large, and finally audit committees. When audit committees were tasked, we noticed that sustainability issues were more often linked to business risks, and were evaluated with other business risks as part of the audit committee's responsibilities, which I thought was an interesting trend to point out. The question of which committee is best for oversight of sustainability issues, I think, also is an interesting one to explore. Most shareholder proposals requesting oversight don't advocate for a particular committee, or they ask for a separate one on their area of interest. One data run I still plan to do as part of some of our follow-up here is looking at whether any particular type of committee has higher rates of sustainability reporting than others, and maybe perhaps looking at other performance metrics in this area. But the split, again, with nominated governance leading, I think, is an interesting one in this area. Next slide, Kelly. Thank you. This is just a brief kind of point of interest here, but another trend coming from the data is that companies with board oversight sustainability issues tended to have more board committees in general. This might be a reflection of their view of the board and its responsibilities and scope for oversight, or their approaches for governance. For example, companies elevating sustainability issues to the board level might view the board's involvement on a wider range of risks and issues as more appropriate than others. But again, interesting that those with oversight had an average of, again, about 4.5 committees, while those without board oversight sustainability issues had an average of about 3.5. Next slide, Kelly. We separated, just as a quick note here, as you're looking at the various bars and the labels underneath. The first thing that we did when we looked at sustainability issues mentioned in the committee charters, or reference to board oversight and sustainability report, is that we separated those duties into 2 basic categories: social and environmental. First, so that we parsed subtopics under each heading. So social came out on top, accounting for 55% of the total, and in fact, all the companies with board oversight and sustainability issues addressed at least one social issue. Environmental, on the other hand, accounted for about a third. Of those, climate change was the most frequently referenced environmental subtopic, but it was only mentioned by 2% of the companies. For social issues, political spending topped the scales by far with 42%, for example, followed by health and safety with 21%, diversity at 9%, and human rights at 4%. And there were a handful of other issues mentioned as well, including a few related to hazardous and general waste management. Biotechnology was mentioned by a few companies. I think you could expect too, like Monsanto. Fair lending among the financial sector was mentioned quite a few times. Data privacy as well. Employee relations and animal testing, especially among pharmaceutical companies. I want to touch upon the issue again about what is actually being overseen by corporate boards, because I think it's important for me to highlight what we think we found and what we know we didn't find. But again, I believe that companies mentioning broader environmental issues, for example, would say climate change is covered. And there's good evidence for this from other research. I'll quickly mention that CDP, for example, found in its 2013 annual questionnaire, its flagship carbon disclosure questionnaire, that is, that 61% of the S&P 500 at board or senior management, I want to underscore the or there, senior management oversight of climate change issues. And the levels of oversight CDP found are higher than those reflected in our study. Again, we have 33%, if you look at the screen there, with their oversight of environmental issues, and 2% that specifically mentioned climate change. I think several factors may explain the discrepancies that we're seeing here. First, companies are probably more likely to charge management with oversight sustainability issues, and particularly climate change, than to elevate it to the board level. So I think a higher percentage of the CDP respondents are likely reporting out some form of management oversight of this issue. But I think it also speaks to the fact that many companies' committee charters are very broadly drafted rather than getting into specifics. And that was reflected in all of the summaries that we collected out of these committee charters as well. Many were not very long descriptions of the sustainability oversight function. And there's, a question here for shareholder proponents and companies ask about what level of detail is appropriate, I think. But this is sort of how it played out across the S&P 500. Kelly, next slide, please. These statistics, I just want to note here as you're looking at the slide, of the percentages are based on the 277 companies with board oversight of sustainability issues, not the entire S&P 500. So that's why you're seeing these higher percentages here, 92%. The 92% specifically stated powers for the committee charged with oversight to hire advisors to assist in fulfilling their duties. 83% specified an independent standard for members of the committee. However, one point that I think is very interesting is that only 5% outlined any specific sort of sustainability knowledge or expertise as a qualification sort for a committee member. And I'm going to touch upon this again on a slide coming up in a moment. Kelly, next slide, please. Again, these data are also based on 277 companies with sustainability board oversight. As noted earlier, 81% specified an independent standard for membership in the committees charged with oversight sustainability issues. The majority of those, 53%, if you sort of add up two of those pie slivers at the bottom there, chose entirely independent committees using definitions for director independence established by the major exchanges, so the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. Another 13% also opted for entirely independent committees, although they specified independent standards outlined in their own corporate governance guidelines. Meanwhile, 11% said a majority independence director standard, and 4% chose other types of formulations. And 19% had no standards stated at all. So you can get a sort of split of where most were looking. As far as independent standards go, again, most were looking for, independent committees to oversee sustainability issues, which I think is an important point to draw out. Next slide, Kelly. As I mentioned earlier, only 5% of companies with board oversight sustainability issues mentioned wanting some form of sustainability expertise on these committees. For example, Halliburton and Noble Energy seek expertise on environmental health and safety issues on the committees charged with their sustainability oversight. And this is an interesting issue. The topic of seeking environmental experts on boards has come up during proxy season in proposals filed by New York City pension funds as well as the New York State Common Retirement Fund. This might be an important issue for proponents and companies to consider if a robust discussion on the board level is going to take place. However, most boards only seek financial experts for the audit committee and appear to take the approach of attracting the best overall board members that are a good fit for the company, who that could seek additional information experts to help them look at other key issues, including sustainability risks. However, when seeking a diversity of expertise and experiences on the board, this might be an area for investors and boards to reflect upon, given its rising importance. Next slide, Kelly. Again, almost all the companies with board oversight sustainability issues chose to give those committee powers to hire outside experts, and I just want to highlight this point again because it appears that companies are looking for board members who perhaps are knowledgeable about a particular aspect of business or their industry. Of course, they have a requirement to have a financial expert, but who then can tap consultants outside of the board to inform them on other issues. However, I think it raises an interesting question about boards. And without some expertise on at least the most pressing sustainability risks for a company, are companies running the risk of reacting to issues rather than proactively addressing them? And again, I think this is an interesting area to explore, to discuss among investors and companies going forward. Next slide, Kelly. Given that all companies face sustainability risks, one might expect an even distribution among industries and companies with board oversight of sustainability issues, but this is not the case. I do want to note quickly here that the paper and forestry industry was the smallest among all the sectors. It only comprised 3 companies, while the average sector had 16 companies within their grouping. Tobacco was another outlier with only 4 companies. Overall, if you count through here, we analyzed 31 sectors overall. And a closer examination reveals that many of the sectors with a higher proportion of companies with board oversight sustainability issues have perhaps been under more intense scrutiny due to controversy surrounding environmental and social issues. For example, paper and forestry in and of itself for sustainable forestry practices, healthcare services for affordability, access, and waste management, oil and gas for climate change, of course, spill and waste management, air emissions, and health and safety violations, utilities, again, for climate change and health and safety issues, aerospace and defense for government dealings and nature of their defense products, tobacco certainly for product liability and public health issues, as well as supply chain concerns surrounding workers' well-being and health, as well as child and forced labor. And you can see these themes in many of the other top sectors, including chemicals and metals and mining too. However, the theory didn't always play out. For example, apparel and footwear companies and retailers have been under the microscope for years since the anti-sweatshop debate was reinvigorated in the 1990s, and they underperformed other sectors in board oversight sustainability issues. I think the same could be said for banking and investments. When you look at fair lending issues and the recent financial crisis, you might expect greater board oversight sustainability issues prompted by that crisis. And technology hardware companies, for example, too, have been under scrutiny for supply chain practices and more recently for links to conflict minerals. So controversies do not explain all the results. And there might be some underlying trends here by industry toward a sort of herd mentality, um, governance practices that too might explain some of the results. However, also company size also seems to play a large role, as we will cover in a moment. So there might be some of that driving some of these differences in levels of board oversight among the sectors. Kelly, next slide, please. Um, by issue, there were a few fewer surprises, I should say. This slide looks at environmental and in particular climate change. Beyond paper and forestry, for example, utilities with 73% and metals and mining with 71%, were other sectors with higher rates of board oversight of environmental issues, which I think wouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Commercial services and tobacco perhaps have not been tasked with environmental issues as much as other sectors, and perhaps explains their lower rates. On climate change, having automakers, utilities, and oil and gas companies, they're the top. I don't think is surprising to anyone. And perhaps neither is having financials, given the scrutiny financing of coal and the other industries' lending practices on climate change. In addition to hotels and restaurants, perhaps for their large property holdings that might be seen as a climate risk as well. So some interesting trends here, but I don't think anything all that shocking. Next slide, Kelly. Thank you. On the social side, having apparel and footwear, metals and mining, and retail in the mix near the top, I don't think should be any surprise to anyone. On human rights. On health and safety, metals and mining and utilities again ranked near the top behind paper and forestry. As the chemicals, again, these are all sectors with higher incidence of health and safety risks to employees. On diversity behind paper and forestry, aerospace and defense and communications ranked high. Communications perhaps is a surprise to many given the industry's high premium on human resources and creativity. Financials, which have been targeted with shareholder proposals on this topic recently, also came in above average at 10%. Political spending too, for the sectors with the highest proportions of references, they tended to focus on industries with close ties to the government and high rates, high stakes rather for regulation. So we saw again here aerospace and defense, no surprise, and healthcare services at the top of the list. Next slide, please, Kelly. As I said earlier, we've often found in our research a strong correlation between sustainability policies, reporting and programs, and company size. And this area was no exception. On this first chart, we separated the companies into quintiles and looked at the rates of board oversight sustainability issues. And they steadily declined by company size from 85% for the top quintile to 25% for the bottom, which I believe represents a fairly large margin running across the S&P 500. Next slide, please, Kelly. This trend also played out in profits for the most part. There was a slight uptick, however, which I found interesting in the rates of board oversight for the bottom quintile. However, overall, there is the same large spread between companies in the top quintile with 82% and the bottom with 43%, with board oversight sustainability issues. And given the results, I think you would expect percentages to drop off fairly quickly for mid and small cap companies, although, again, later I suggest that this might be an interesting area for future research as well. Next slide, please, Kelly. So the data opened up many questions that could be answered by additional research. although some of it could prove more difficult than others. For example, with this benchmark data, it'd be interesting where we are in 1 year or 5 years or a decade from now and see how this issue develops going forward. As I mentioned, also would be good to confirm or dispel the correlation between company size and board oversight features with studies of smaller companies. Perhaps even more compelling would be an international perspective. For example, conventional wisdom holds that European and Australian firms are more attuned to sustainability concerns than American companies. So it would be useful to see how non-U.S. companies approach board oversight sustainability issues across various markets. In addition, I think a logical question to ask, and perhaps one on the minds of many board members, corporate executives, and sustainability champions, is whether having board oversight of sustainability issues actually leads to better sustainability outcomes for those companies. We did the brief check on sustainability reporting. However, linking the data we collected for this report with key metrics by industry sector can yield some insights into whether board oversight of these issues is having positive impacts on the companies and their practices. Whether there is any link to financial performance, too, could be another area for research. Finally, the merits of having sustainability expertise on the board could be another area for study going forward. And I'm sure there are plenty of others. I'm happy to answer questions on those at the end of the presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for your attention while I walk you through the findings. Now I'm going to pass the presentation over to John for some additional perspectives on the findings before we begin our question and answer period. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I want to give my impression of how this research fits into the theory and practice of modern American capitalism. And I will in a moment, but first I wanted to say that though this research feels a little granular, what committees, what expertise, what standards, what industry, etc., it's that granularity that I think gives it weight. For we can all wish to improve the accountability of American public corporations, but it's this type of on-the-ground research and data that enable companies, investors, and other stakeholders to actually execute on those wishes. So I think Peter and SI2 have performed a very valuable benchmarking service, and I thank you again. I also want to note that Peter and SI2 are in the midst of some follow-up research, which should be out in a couple of months, looking at how major American corporations include or do not include sustainability as a metric in determining CEO compensation. That said, I do think this report is a perfect example of a situation where the glass is half full or the glass is half empty, depending on your viewpoint. The half full is pretty clear. 55.5% of S&P 500 companies think these issues are important enough for board oversight. Having been a board member, time is your most limited commodity, and to be on the board agenda signifies that there is a growing understanding among directors and senior executives that sustainability issues pose financial and other risks and opportunities to companies. They affect the long-term viability and profitability of these companies. And so I think that's a very positive result. On the other hand, Kelly, if you'll see the next slide, what that means, of course, is that half of the companies don't have oversight, or 45%. I'd like to pose a simple question. What the heck are they thinking? It is a disconnect with the population of the world, with their customers, their suppliers, their communities. Edelman, the public relations firm, does a well-respected trust barometer that they've been doing for 14 years. They unveil it at Davos every year. And in the 2014 version, they found that 84% of the people in 27 markets around the world, and this includes the U.S., believe a company, quote, can take specific actions that both increase profits and improve the economic and social conditions in the world in which it operates. So there's a certain disconnect when you have half of the companies, perhaps narrowly, but in some sense, elevating this to a board level oversight and half not. Now, I do not in any way, shape, or form want to imply that the other half of the companies do not care about these issues. As Peter said with the CDP data, that may be tasked to management. But in terms of long-range planning, which is a board responsibility, it seems clear that this is a trend that is going to move to have more board oversight of sustainability issues, and that's probably a good thing. So if, in fact, we do this as a time series, Peter, I would expect that over time, and I don't know what that time period is, we would see an increase in the numbers. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kelly to let people ask questions and hopefully to provide some answers.
Terrific. Thank you, Peter and John. We're now on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Again, if you have questions, type into the question box what your question is, and I will read it aloud for John and Peter. If you would prefer to ask your question over the audio, just type a question, open up my phone line, and I can do that for you. We have several questions in the queue, and I noticed one of them, and I'll take that as the first question. Will this slide deck be available? The answer is yes. The slide deck and a replay of this webinar will be available on the IRC website by tomorrow. I will send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered for the call with that link to the replay and to the PowerPoint. So that was the easy question. I like to take the easy questions myself first and leave the more in-depth ones for John and Peter. And here's the first one we have, gentlemen. What were your expectations going into the study, and how did the findings meet those predictions or surprise you in the end? So that's a good one for Peter.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't know if I expected that a majority of the S&P 500 would have board oversight of at least a single social or environmental issue. And I knew, political spending would figure prominently given the size and the scope of the shareholder campaign over the years and the volume of proposals in that area. But again, I did not expect it to dominate trends as much as it did. And I guess I did expect for those with board oversight of social and environmental issues that there would be a bit of a broader scope usually, that they would, in looking at a single issue that perhaps had an impact on their company or was a particular sustainability risk for their sector, that they would sort of investigate other issues and then decide upon maybe a general sustainability oversight function rather than just ticking off political spending or ticking off a particular issue, which I found, I expected maybe boards to be a little bit more strategic in the way that they approached setting up a board oversight function for sustainability in general. I also expected perhaps a bit more of an emphasis on director expertise that we found. I didn't expect a very large percentage to require or say that it would be nice if we had somebody on this committee who had expertise perhaps in environmental health and safety or another issue, but I did expect it to be higher than 5%. And I also found some of the committee choices to be a bit surprising. For example, I didn't expect so many governance-oriented committees to be tasked with sustainability issues, as opposed to separate committees looking at public policy issues. But perhaps that's just my own perception of the S&P 500 in the marketplace. But I thought that was interesting that the sort of melding of governance and sustainability issues on committees for discussion. And I guess I didn't expect the industry revenue and net income results to be so pronounced. I did expect to see some definitely differences between top quintile income and and revenue companies at bottom, but I expect the spread to be so wide. And those are just some of my quick impressions.
Thank you, Peter. Our next question, is the independence definition tied to where sustainability is located? If sustainability is under the governance nominating committee, the committee would have its own NASDAQ or NYSE requirements on independence.
Yes. So, for example, when sustainability issues were combined with the nominating and governance function, there's a single committee charter, and the independent standard would be enumerated either by listing requirements or immediately at the end of the charter, and it refers to the entire committee. They don't specify independent standards for particular members of that committee who are covering sustainability issues. So just to explain our method a little bit, that's how we arrived at some of our results. I think it is interesting to look at whether or not there's a correlation between independent standards and the committees chosen. And I didn't review the data for that, but if you leave Kelly your contact information, I'm happy to take a quick look later and then send out some quick information on it, because I think it's an interesting question.
And I just add that, remember, 81% of the 277 companies had independence definitions of the 81%, or of the total, so 75% of the 81% did cite either NASDAQ, NYSE, or NASDAQ guidelines, so those are definitely tied into their listing standards.
Thanks, gentlemen. The next question we have, how do boards define environment versus climate change?
You want to take this, Peter?
Okay, no, yeah, I'm happy to take it.
I'm laughing because Peter and I have had several conversations about this. Peter was working off of written documentation, and I think that it is, my perspective is that many companies say environment and they mean to include a number of specifics, such as climate change, water, and various other issues. Climate change, because if you say just 2% mention climate change, that seems like a very small number, intuitively to me. And if I were drafting a committee, I would say you're charged with our environmental oversight. I think Peter raised a very good issue, which is what is the level of specificity that should be included in these charters, and secondarily, what is the level of transparency around that specificity? And so we are working off of the materials that exist, or Peter, I shouldn't claim any responsibility or credit for it. Peter was working off of the materials that exist, and for this purpose, it had to specifically mention, as Peter said, climate change or carbon footprint or greenhouse gas to be considered that. And so I would suspect that actually the majority of that 33% also include climate change as part of their oversight responsibilities.
I would just quickly add, and John, I think that was well said. I would just quickly add the reason why I underscored so many times in the presentation, and I do it in the report too, that we're parsing documents here just to look at how specific companies get in these charters, to look at some of the differentiation between companies, but we're not meaning to say that only 2% of the S&P 500 has board oversight of climate change. 2% mention it, but far many more look at environmental issues more broadly. And, again, the question I raised, I think, is an important one of what level of detail are we to expect here, and what's appropriate. I think that's a question for shareholder proponents, for the broader investment community, and for companies to weigh going forward.
Thank you. The next question, Is SI2 or the IRC Institute in contact with the UN Global Compact? One of their 6 project lines has to do with the sustainability training of corporate boards of the lead companies. This data might be useful to them.
Yeah, I had a phone call from them. And again, there might be, a capacity for us to do some sort of a webinar or to reach out further. And I did highlight the research to them, and now that the report's public, and we have the data, I think there's definitely room for us to provide an educational function there.
Thank you. Our next question relates to the political spending data. What about political spending has caused it to be taken up so quickly by boards? How does this differ from other sustainability issues? And why doesn't climate change seem to compare given its significant ramifications?
I guess I might be able to answer this in 2 words and just say Citizens United. I think it was a sort of lightning rod for shareholder proponents. And I think we've seen an unprecedented level of shareholder activism coordination on this issue that we haven't seen on many other issues in the past. In the volume of proposals that we've seen out there, and the levels of support that they're getting. And again, the way the vast majority of these resolutions are structured is they're asking for disclosure from companies with a number of other requests among the board oversight requests as well. And so there's, the board oversight political spending is just one aspect of this campaign. But I think its success is readily apparent in our findings. It's interesting that the exposure resolutions has prompted so many companies to go out there and tick off political spending as a board oversight function. And perhaps maybe it resonated with a lot of boards that this was a real risk to them, regardless of how they felt about broader sustainability issues, that political spending in particular was an area that they should have oversight of going forward. So I think that explains part of it, perhaps not all of it, but definitely part of it.
Thank you. Next question. What were the incentives for those 5% of companies that did have sustainability standards for the board members?
Oh, what did they say? Meeting. I noted 2 examples earlier. Noble Energy, and one other that that specified environmental health and safety in their expertise standards, and I think that was in the limited number of companies that did have expertise standards, it was often referred to either as environmental health and safety expertise that they were seeking, or some sort of a scientific background steeped in the issues that were at the highest risk profile for the company. I saw it worded both ways, but those were the 2 principal types of expertise that if companies, boards were looking for it, how they phrased what they were looking for, if that makes sense.
The next question, you mentioned that there were a very small number of companies studied actively looking for individuals to add to the board with area expertise. Instead of board members will hire outside experts. Is this an oversight or deliberate? Where are the experts sought? Do you need me to read that again? Was that good?
No, I think I understand the question.
Okay.
The answer is simply we don't know. I think it's interesting that, and I don't think this is in any sort of particular way a reflection of a special circumstance for the treatment of sustainability issues. For example, I don't think boards went out there and said, these committees that are charged with oversight of sustainability issues, they need outside experts. So we have to be sure to enumerate that in these committee charters. I read a lot of committee charters, and I saw 1 to 2 sentence, phrases at the end of many of them that said, hey, this committee, in order to, for example, to fulfill its duties and to fulfill its responsibilities to the board and to the company, if they feel that they need outside experts, they are free to go out and go ahead and get them, and that will be funded. And I think that's just the nature of how boards and companies view the board's function in overseeing a number of risks. I think they realize that many board members are going to be perhaps very familiar with the company or the industry or a particular business issue, and they might be great generalists and great board members for those reasons, but they're not going to be knowledgeable about everything. And maybe even certain committees would be knowledgeable about every single topic that will come up in a discussion because of an incident or a new and emerging risk. And I think they want boards and board committees have the flexibility to seek outside advice when they need it. And so I don't think it's a big surprise that many of these committees have that ability. Stated name, I believe probably even the committees that didn't specifically state that phrase in their committee charters probably also are free to go out there and hire experts as well. Now, with that said, I don't know, we have no idea if committees charged with sustainability oversight are seeking outside advice at all. I think probably the proponents out there and a number of the investors who are engaging companies on this issue might have a better idea than I do about what the state of play is out there and the extent to which company boards are calling up various organizations out there who are very active on various issues or seen as experts on certain issues. Whether or not they're asking for their advice, I think it's an interesting question.
We have a couple more questions and a couple minutes left on the webinar. We'll keep plowing through them. What do you attribute the uptick in human rights issues that could? What do you attribute the uptick in human rights issues? Could policy developments such as the UN framework for guiding principles be playing a role, or do you see this activity only in sectors targeted by activists or after a crisis or reputational risk?
It's a shareholder campaign that Heritage Investments, for example, has been very active on for a number of years. And from what we see from the diversity of other investors and proponents getting involved, I think there's growing interest there. I think that's playing a role. I think the Ruggie principles certainly sort of got investors on their toes and got them to think about the roles of boards in oversight of human rights issues and what it means for companies, especially with perhaps more pronounced human rights risks than others. So I think those are definitely contributing to sort of the uptick in interest in human rights and the role of the board in overseeing those risks.
Oh, thank you. The next question, what's the history of shareholder resolutions calling for sustainability expertise amongst board members?
If you went back to if you go back to the slide, and again, the slides will be available to everybody. Thanks to Kelly, so thank you for doing that. I have a slide that goes up there that sort of tracks the issues over the decades. And so initially, there were like a trickle of proposals very, very early on, decades ago, on a few on ethics and a few other topics, and none on sustainability. So nobody mentioned we want a board committee on sustainability all the way back then. But now we're seeing that grow. So we are seeing a growing number, although a much smaller number than resolutions looking at political spending, which I want to emphasize. But we're seeing a growing number of board oversight resolutions every year, many coming to votes at companies that are asking for broader sustainability oversight. And I have to say that I'm a little bit surprised we don't see more of them. For example, if you're, I know many proponents are trying to raise other issues at companies and use the board oversight tact as a way to do that. But if you're going to ask for board oversight of one particular issue, would you be more inclined to have your company have board oversight more broadly of sustainability issues? I mean, I think that's another question to ask, but the numbers of proposals we are seeing are growing.
I'm not sure. Did I move to the right slide, Peter? Is that the right slide you wanted to refer to?
I think it's slide 9, Kelly.
Oh, slide 9. Here's the
Correct.
slide Peter
Thank
was
you, John.
referring to. Sorry about
I was
that.
just looking through my deck to see where it was.
Yeah, so it's slide 9 on shareholder proposal trends.
I will just, someone asked the history, just as a curiosity, I will mention that following the Exxon Valdez disaster, which obviously also gave birth to Ceres, that was one of the key investor and stakeholder requests of Exxon, that they put an environmental expert on the board. So there is a history here, but it is, my experience is that it has been used sparingly because there are a limited number of board members, and board members have to be cognizant of a number of things, as Peter said, and that is not to at all minimize environmental or social expertise, but it sort of depends on what's the pressing issues facing a company. Every company has financials, every company has operations, every company needs domain expertise, every company has their CEO on the board. Okay, there are a limited number of slots, and so where this most commonly occurs is in heavy environmental exposure, oil, gas, mining, extractive, or actually the pharmaceutical industry, where people often want a public policy person or a scientist on the board because it is so core to the corporate mission.
Thank you. And our last question, what trends do you see unfolding in the near and long term on this issue?
I can go ahead, John, and you can follow up afterwards. I see continued pressure from shareholders in the way of engagement activities and the filing of shareholder proposals. I expect we'll see broader adoption of board oversight of sustainability issues going forward, especially in higher impact industries, perhaps that are lagging. Hopefully, this research will spark sort of an analysis of the state of the land out there, what perhaps might be weaknesses in certain companies based on their practices, or perhaps companies will start to react. They see their competitors have sustainability board oversight, and perhaps that will get them to have a discussion on their boards about what their practices are, what should be stated in committee charters or be made clear going forward. I also think there might be a call for a broader discussion of some of the underlying issues regarding committee choice and expertise, as well as the overall efficacy of the practice. I think these are, all good questions for investors and companies to ask looking ahead. In particular, I think a central question is what works best. And maybe it isn't a single answer for every company or every industry. There might be many answers to these questions, but I think, it's a call for additional research and a call for a broader debate out there on the issue.
For those of you who may follow IRC Institute webinars, if you were on the webinar 2 weeks ago about the state of engagement, there was a fair amount of discussion about SEC Commissioner Dan Gallagher claiming that environmental and social issues had hijacked, his word, not mine, the agenda of shareholder proposals. So while I agree with Peter, I think we also need to be cognizant that there is a countervailing force that suggests that these issues shouldn't be the subject of shareholder pressure at all. I actually think that Peter's research benefits from being real world. It does not take a normative view of what should be or shouldn't be. And I think that what you're seeing here is a trend that will continue despite what may be some heavy political fighting overhead from the two trends of the world, those who believe that corporations are in and of the real world, and those who believe that corporations are a series of entities that you trade as securities. And so I think that there will be lots of distractions and fights around that. And in the meantime, the men and women who sit on boards and who are senior level executives and those of us who invest in these companies will continue to have conversations with each other. And I think that as sustainability issues, climate change, and other issues become more key to the long-term viability of the company, the political shrewdness will become less and less important, and the companies will just continue to meet investors and other stakeholders in the middle and do what people think best for the long-term viability of the companies. And in most cases, that includes some level of board oversight of these issues.
And with that, I'll thank both John and Peter for their comments today, and thanks to all of you for your participation and interest in the research. Again, this webinar will be available for replay tomorrow, as well as the PowerPoint. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us. John and Peter's contact information is on the screen there, and we would be happy to follow up with you. This concludes the webinar, and we hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly.